Should you pound the power or reach for speed? How and when to adjust projections, and a new way of looking at the drafting landscape through the eyes of a market premium. ESPN's Tristan Cockcroft joins us next on Beat the Shift. Welcome to another episode of the Beat the Shift podcast. I am your host, Ariel Cohen, and with me as always, Ruvain Guy. How are you, Ruvain?
I'm doing great. How are you doing today?
I'm doing great, and Happy New Year to you. Football, those who have been doing fantasy football, for most of you that's over, and it's now straight ahead, straight to baseball. How's your New Year's?
My New Year's was great. My football team actually finished in third, which is not great. I had another team that finished in first, but we split the pot, which is another topic of conversation. If you're winning your league, whether you want to split it, if you're in the championship game, we decided to split, and we would have won anyway, so there's that.
There you go. Well, good for you. Well, we've got a great show today. We have ESPN senior analyst. He is the co-host of the Fantasy Focus Baseball podcast. He's won a couple of Labor Expert League championships and 3 Tout Wars championships all in a row. Welcome to Beat the Shift. Welcome, Tristan Cockcroft. How are you?
Doing well. Hey, Ariel. Hey, Ruvain. Good to talk to you again. And yeah, it's interesting to hear football there. It's time to pass the baton over to baseball. But Ruvain, I sympathize with you here that I was in literally the same spot as you. First place, having split the pot, and a third place finish in my next biggest league.
No.
It just goes to show how aggressive we are in leagues, that you want to be more conservative at the end just to get that finish, just to get that money, I guess.
It's always tough as a decision for me in football, just because that's around holiday time. Sometimes you want to just not sweat it that last Sunday. You know, it's a difficult decision.
Well, mine was my neighbor, so I wanted to keep my neighbor happy. That's all.
Right. You're asking an actuary here if you want to be risk averse and split it. I almost always split it, but that's just me. I shy away from risk, which is a lot of what we're going to talk about today. But on our strategy section, I'm going to talk about projections. Not about how they're created, but rather in how you use them, how they intertwine with rankings, how you can adjust them, and so on and so forth. So let's just throw this out to you very generally, Tristan. How do you use projections in creating your rankings, in how you draft, and so on and so forth?
So there's a couple of ways that I use them. Initially, I'll use a very basic end of the previous season rough projection, close to what Marcel's are. That I just developed very, very quickly on my own to create a base set of rankings. I find it extremely difficult to just sit down with a piece of paper, and in this case it would be a spreadsheet, but just think in the virtual world like a, quote, piece of paper. It will give me an initial set to start from, and then what I'll do there is I'll start taking my own opinions and moving players around. Later in the process, the other way in which projections come into play for me are that they serve as a safety net. They eliminate outliers. There could be cases where a player I thought was a lot better than he really should be might be 500 spots off in terms of the projection. And in that case, it's going to flag those in my spreadsheet, and then I'll sit down and check that player, review him, and see whether I truly feel that way about him and decide where I want to settle. Am I going to cut that 500 spot gap down, or am I going to just go out on an island on that player? And one of the interesting parts about that is that because I do a lot of those list generated columns, so for example, the Tristan's 20 at the beginning of the year, one of the ways in which I find players, candidates for that list is this method, is that if I see a projection that's way off from where I have the player ranked, then I know immediately right there, early in the game, that's probably going to be a player that I'm planting my flag on, if you will, and he'll end up being on a kind of the early draft candidates list for the Tristan's 20.
Interesting. We do things a little bit differently in terms of, on this show, we're very much into the ATC projections and use that as the backbone of a lot of our analysis. The general method is we come up with the ATC projections and we take a look at the market. We see where ATC is much higher than the market is doing, and then we do a deep dive into whether we agree with that. And if we agree with that assessment of the player by looking at his underlying, as highlighted by ATC, then we know we're in a good spot and we can focus on setting up who we want to go after. We're not really big on ranking here. We're more interested in highlighting the right players. Ruvain, you want to add to that?
Yeah, one other thing that we do is that besides just taking the numbers that the computer spits out, we actually go through every single player and we check off and see whether or not the computer had an error, because that sometimes happens, and we have to look at playing time. And it's the main thing with all these players right now is for any type of projections set is that you have to see the playing time and if it makes sense to what the numbers spit out. If they don't make sense, or let's say if something is way off, then you have to edit it and you have to change it accordingly.
So the question to you, Tristan, is when you're looking at projections, what about the projections are you most inclined to change manually? Is it going to be the playing time? Do you find that projections don't get home runs right, stolen bases right? What do you find yourself really disagreeing with projections more often than not?
Almost, I'd say at least 3/4 of the time, my biggest objection with projections is the playing time. I actually think it's the greatest failing we have overall in the projections field, is that we struggle to project playing time. The other thing, too, is you get the philosophical question of, do you over-project playing time? Zips, just to throw one example for projections here, has this philosophy of projecting what a player would do if he played a good amount of time in Major League Baseball. So you're always going to end up with way more playing time than you could possibly use on a fantasy team, and especially a major league team. I like to project players close to where I think they're actually going to play. Frankly, since as far back as I can remember, that's been one of the big things for me, is that when I'm adjusting projections, that's where I'm being the most aggressive manually, is that I will take a stance on, I think this player is an everyday 675 to 700 PA type of player, and I'm going to let the projection there speak for itself based on that number. Beyond that, I'll usually flag a few players. The one that didn't work out that great last year was Chris Davis. I'd say the good one, except neither of them were particularly good last year. The A's one had an injury that I thought influenced his numbers quite a bit in 2019, especially the final 4 months of the year. So I'll usually jot down examples like that where I think that the numbers I drew in for the projections in the first place were influenced unfairly usually by an injury, or if a player was just in a bad situation, ballpark. If they had an extreme shift in their ground ball fly ball rate. Josh Bell is another guy that comes to mind for me this season. I might do a little bit of a manual projection, but I always try to remind myself not to stray too far. The playing time is the one where I'm going to make the biggest tweaks.
Yeah, I agree. And I've noticed that the high-skilled players, even who are not projected with that much playing time, I often see that the ATC projections just themselves bump them up. For example, last year, Dominic Smith, high-skilled player, but people didn't know, is he going to play, when he's going to play, where he's going to play. Well, ATC had a little bit higher a playing time because of his high skill, and that helped out. Thinking from the year before that, DJ LeMahieu. People didn't know where he's going to play. Well, you got Andahar, you got Gleyber Torres. Where in the world is DJ LeMahieu going to play? Are the Yankees going to play him 4 times a week or not? But the high-skilled players generally get a bump in playing time because they're good, and hey, Ruvain can tell you, it's so easy to get injured these days that if you underproject some of those high-skilled players, and you will find out that you're going to miss out on some of the best bargains of all of fantasy. Ruvain?
Yeah, I totally agree. I think the injury aspect is one of the biggest aspects, because there are a couple major pitchers coming back this year from season-ending surgeries. You have Chris Sale coming back. You have Noah Syndergaard coming back. When are they coming back? What's their playing time going to be? Are they going to be fully effective when they come back? These are all questions that it's not a matter of the rates at this point. It's a matter of just the playing time. Because if you think, let's say, Chris Sale and Noah Syndergaard, they had surgery within a week apart of each other. If they're both attempting to come back around June, but one of them comes back in May and one of them comes back in July, it's so hard to be able to figure out what's going to happen. There are a lot of players who are coming off of surgery during the off season, and even when something like that, you don't know how things are going to play out. So there's a lot of different for injury. It's a crapshoot unless you know the person himself and how they're feeling. It's basically a crapshoot.
Yeah, a word about projections. No set of projections are going to be perfect. The best projections only get things right 60 to 70% of the time. The really good ones get them right almost 70%, and the crappier ones get them a little bit below 60%. But if you are going to stray far off of projections in the long run, you're going to do yourself more harm. Sure, there can be a player that you might say, you know what, I think he was very unlucky last year. I think the projections are not giving him credit for a change in his swing, or maybe he has a new batting instructor. Sure, you should alter those projections, and you should take your eye test and do it. But if you're going to do that on a regular basis, you're going to find that you're not going to beat the projections. The automation of rates are proven to be great in the long run. We talk. Ruben just mentioned that we take the ATC projections and we say, okay, where are we going to adjust it? Where do we think that it's wrong in terms of playing time? But what I actually did, and what I do is I spit out whatever the rankings say based on the ATC unadjusted projections, and I send them out to Fantasy Pros. Lo and behold, in 2019. Those set of rankings were the number one rankings. So I was listed on Fantasy Pros as the number one most accurate expert, and that was not from me doing anything. That was completely the computer of ATC projections doing it. So it shows you, now it's not going to end up first every single year, but in the long run, I expect it to be one of the higher ones, rather than just completely coming up manually or touching up so many projections and whatnot. Now, question to you, Tristan. If you're going to adjust a projection, if you're going to say, I think a player is better or not, how do you incorporate that into your rankings? Do you just go straight to the rankings and say, I got to bump them up a few spots judgmentally? Or should you go into the projections, change them, and then run a valuation system and see how much it actually comes up and do that? Like, what's the right way to do it?
So for me, it's a little different than I think the average fantasy player, just because I work off an Excel sheet that generates dollar values, and from that I get rankings. And what I like to do with it is I will actually experiment with the player, that individual player's projections among the field of Major League Baseball, and see exactly how that's changing his rank. I don't want to just do it manually. I don't want to just tell myself I'm going to give him a 5-spot bump. That doesn't feel right to me. I actually will go in there, add what I feel or subtract what I feel is right. And very often, as we were saying before with the playing time, I'll adjust the playing time up or down, see what it does to him, how wide is his range on that entire list, and then I'll make a decision as to where I rank the player. And it's not something that sometimes I can do, on a whim. If a trade, for example, if a trade happens today, I probably will need to go in there and kind of ballpark it with the rankings. We're at a little bit of an early stage pre-spring training where I'm probably not sitting there in front of that spreadsheet every minute, moving the guy up and down 5 plate appearances or, 1 or 2 extra wins. But that's generally what I'll do. I'll actually be doing that, adding a win or 2 for a guy going to a better team, Lance Lynn in his situation, and see exactly what that meant for him in terms of the rank.
Right. I'll say one thing, though, about playing time and how to use projections. It's not just about pick a number. Right. The example I like to give from a couple years ago is Rich Hill. Rich Hill was always fantastic when he pitched. You just never knew how much he'd give. He'd always get injured and so on and so forth. But the question is, should you draft him at the right price? And rather than just picking a number and saying, I think he's going to pitch 110 innings, you should be running projections at what you think a maximum is, what you think a minimum is, and compare that price that you get from running that to what he's going for in the market. So if let's say you run him and say, okay, what if Rich Hill only gives me 80 innings? What would he be worth? And, you run your projections and it says, okay, 10th round. And then you run him and say, okay, and what if he is going to be pitching 130 innings? Oh, that bumps him up to a 7th round. See where he's going. Is he a bargain, both in the minimum and maximum cases? Is it a toss-up whether, if he beats his average, then he'll be a bargain. If it's not, then no. The key here is a sensitivity test. I think it's a great thing not to go straight to rankings. I think that everyone should get an auction calculator tool or something, generate dollar value rankings so that you yourself can put in your estimates of sensitivity testing. Maybe you have your own idea of putting in a number of at-bats or a number of innings pitched, and do the analysis yourself. That's what I like to do. Ruben?
Well, one player that would really be a good litmus test is Shohei Ohtani, because his value skyrockets when he's able to pitch. Is he going to be pitching all year? Is he going to be pitching in a 5-man rotation? Is he going to be pitching in a 6-man rotation? Is it even going to stay in the rotation? So a player like that, you have to, there are extreme highs and lows.